Hand files are the second most dollar value piece of equipment that the dentist uses, so it's appropriate that we do a little bit of training on these and understand a little more about how they're used, where they're used, and why they're used. That's what this video is about. So here we go. Just like to spend a bit of time going over finding canals with hand files. Also how we use them to follow canals and what we do there. What we do to generate glide path with our hand files. How we use them to assist our working length calculations. And what we do to create a very nice 3D image of the anatomy. Okay, here I've drawn the calcifications in yellow. So when we're looking for canals, obviously when we've cut the excess cavity and removed the coronal interferences here, so when that's been removed and cutting excess cavities a little bit outside what I wanted to talk about. So once we've cut and removed that, so we've got sufficient straight line access to get into these canals. So we may have to remove a little bit of the cervical tissue here, depending on how conservative we want to be, there and here. Now we can start looking for these canals with files, and if we use a stiffer hand file in this area of the canal here, and this area of the canal here, then it gives us a bit of leverage and we can push down. So the files that are the 06, the 08, and the 10 are obviously very flexible. And these flexible files, if they're too flexible, they just buckle under the pressure of us using our hands to push into the calcified canals. So what you want is a stiffer or more rigid 06, more rigid 08 and 10. And these come in the form of patency files from Comet. So patency files from Comet, and they can be used in this area, just in the cervical region or the pulp chamber floor. So once you've entered the canal and found the canals, lower molar, and so this will be the mesial root and this will be the distal root, mesiodistal. So remember from the training previously that the mesial root has two canals. It has the mesiolingual canal and the mesiobuccal canal. And quite often the mesiobuccal joins into the mesiolingual. Somewhere about 2 to 3 millimeters from the terminus of the canal. And this can quite often be a sharp junction just in this area here. And this is quite often where the files or the rotary files break. So even when you're using a small hand file, you really want these hand files coming around these curvatures and lower molars to be very flexible. So in the mesiolingual canal, which is generally the straighter of the two, and the lower molar and the mesial root, the mesiolingual, and then mesiobuccal can be somewhat more curly. So you want it to be able to pass around these curves. So you want a flexible file. So you really want two types of files. You want quite a stiff file to enter the calcified. And I've drawn the calcifications, by the way, in yellow. The original canal would be, without calcifications, much wider and extend into a bigger diameter here. But the calcifications over the time of the patient's life, and under big heavy restorations can become quite severe. So you want a stiff file here to literally enter these canal systems here from the pulp chamber into the canal and down in the distal parts of the roots where you can get quite curvy, bendy, small S shapes, etc., etc. You want flexible files. So here you want the flexible files, and here you want the stiff files. So that's the find and following. So to find, you have the stiff file. To follow, you need a more flexible file. And then for the glide path, to make the glide path, you want to get this part, or the apex, up to at least a size 15 hand file. And because you're taking, a reasonably sized piece of metal down there, you want it to be reasonably flexible. So that's both the distal canal and the mesial root, distal root. So the 15 has to, the apex, or within 1 millimeter of your working length. I'm going to talk about working length and what that means shortly, but you need the size 15 file. So you would have already worked through, more than likely, if you started a 6 or an 06, then gone on to 08, and gone on to a 10. Then remember, Comet files have a 12 file, which is very useful because the jump from a 10 to a 15, this transition here is quite large. So the 12 files are quite useful. So when you're working up through this array of files, you're looking to get the size, sort of 1 millimeter back, or to your working length at a size 15. And that is the very first part of making an excellent glide path, if you can get that size 15 to that length. After that, you can use glide path files. Comet have some very nice glide path files, so too do Colteen and various other manufacturers too. So once you've found your canals, you've followed your canals, and you've got a glide path, somewhere in those find, follow and glide, you would have been working on getting working length. Working length is defined as the distance from a reference point in the coronal aspect of the cusp region here to the minor foramen here. And I need to define minor foramen, which I'll do shortly. But the file will extend, so here will be the handle of the file up here. And the file will traverse the pulp chamber into the canal and then get to the minor foramen, or the minor constriction. So minor foramen, minor constriction, depending on what you like to call it. The working length will be from generally your buccal cusp, so the rubber stopper will sit here on the file like that, and so the working length will literally be from there to the minor foramen, or the minor constriction. So minor foramen, or sometimes called the minor constriction, there. If you look at the area that we were talking about, the minor foramen or the minor constriction, and take a closer look, basically what you see is, if I blow this up here, change color to white, you literally have the root canal coming down, and you have the minor constriction here, and then literally this bolus is out and that's the end of the root there radiographically. So that constitutes the major foramen there. This is inside the canal here, and this is outside the canal here. So your working length should extend to the minor foramen, which is this minor foramen, or minor constriction, whichever you like to call it. And so when you take a file, the size 15 file should be either at your minor foramen, or some people like it just a little bit short. So I'm just going to draw the file just a little bit short. How much short depends on who you talk to. And if we were just to dictate, for argument's sake, that distance there to be half a millimeter. Oh, half a millimeter. So that's the basic anatomy anyway of the root end, and it's never that straightforward, but when you look at it in general terms, that's good enough. Just one other really nice tip with the comet files. What you find is along the shank. So if I just draw the shank of the comet file, it looks something like this. It's 20 millimeters, it's 19 millimeters, it's 18 millimeters, 17, 16, and similarly on the other side, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, and this is where the flutes start here, and the file progresses down like this, so the flutes are here on the file. A lot of files don't have these indentations at 18 millimeters, 18, 19, and 20 millimeter lengths. So 20, 19, and 18. Why are these good? Because when you have a look at these files when they're in the tooth, in a radiograph, in a periapical radiograph, you can actually see very clearly these lines and where they appear in the radiograph. 18, 19, 20. Always on all the normal files, 99% of them that is, the flutes of the files here, they stop at 16. So the fact that you can see these indentations in the radiograph, you get a very good visual of actually the working length as it appears radiographically as well. It is worth noting that Comet and maybe one or two other files have these indentations, but most files do not have that particular feature. It is also worth noting that when you take one of the smaller, maybe let's just say an 06 hand file, into a very tight canal, like we're seeing here in the distal root of this lower molar, you find that it forms a very nice impression of the canal itself. So when you take this file out, you may see something like this. So come down, and then you see a little curve there, and it may be something like that. And that impression that the file, so here's the file handle up here, file handle, and here's the tip down here. The 06 file, because it's a very small size, does keep an impression of the shape of the canal. So that's very nice, because it does give you a little bit of a 3D picture of the actual shape of the root canal as you're working in it, which is highly desirable to get a 3D impression as you're working. So you can get that obviously from the radiograph, and and I'll talk a little bit more about that soon, and from this impression that the small file can give you. So just in summary, hand files, great for finding canals, following canals, creating a glide path, using for working length. Obviously I didn't mention that quite often an apex locator is attached to a hand file, and for getting a very nice 3D picture of the anatomy. It's apart from other things. And I'll go over a few other tips and tricks shortly when I go through the comments later. Just take a look at the cross sections of each different type of file and what are the features and benefits of having a cross section like that. So here's the cross sections, and we'll just go over each one, but what I mean by that is here's the the handle of the hand file, here's the file, the blades, and if we take a cross section literally through here, these are the cross sectional areas that we will see. So standard K file that you refer to as a K file is a square cross section. The next one, call it a K-flex file. Dentsply I think refer to it as a flex O file, and the triangular cross section referred to it as a triple flex, for a logical reason, because it's a triangular cross section, and pretty much these three, as we work through them, increase in flexibility. So it's basically just a function of the cross-sectional area. The square is the stiffest, and the K-flex is a little bit more flexible, and the triple flex is the most flexible of them all. And then you have an H file. It is reasonably flexible, but principally using for a rapid enlargement of the canals rather than the flexibility. And then you have Reimers, and the Reimers are very similar to a K file or a square K file. The only difference is the number of flutes in the file. So if we draw two files, and one of them is a standard K file, and one of them, so I'll just denote a K file and denote a Reimer. The K file, the flutes are very tight and horizontal like this, and the Reimer are far more spread out and longitudinal, if you like that. Just one more point, the K files do have another variation where they take the file and they actually heat treat it. What that does is create a far stiffer metal. So the K files in the Comet range also come in a very stiff file called a patency file, Patency, which is a little bit confusing because patency does have a very specific name in endodontics. So Comet patency file is basically just a very stiff K file, which are great for really heavy calcified canals, because as I said previously, the 06, the 08 and the 10 files, which you really should sell to everybody who does endodontics, because they're going to have calcification sometime in their life. They are very much better to work through those calcifications being the heat treated metal than just the normal stainless steel file. So I've mentioned a little bit about calcifications and a little bit about curly bendy canals. Obviously in the calcifications you need quite a stiff rigid file, like I mentioned before, something like the Comet patency file, and in curvy end that would obviously be a heat treated, draw a heat treated in red, square cross section like that, and then you would have the in the curvy bendy. You'd probably prefer the triangular cross section of the triple flex files, and a lot of other dental companies have very similar style files. So this was a Comet patency PATENCY files. Curdo the path files. Dentsply does a C+ file. The VDW do a C pilot file. So there's a lot of different types of heat treated files, but the Comet ones are very, very nice. And as I've already told you, the working length is very nice to read it radiographically of the little indentations in the shank of the file. Probably mentioned to you in the past, never ever force either a hand file or a rotary file. If you do with the hand file, what you will do is create ledges and other sort of indentations in the wall. So let's just say we're taking a hand file down the mesiolingual root of this lower molar, or the lower mesial root. So I should have written this mesiolingual canal, mesiobuccal canal. As we take the file down here, it's going to get to this, try to go around this curve, and it won't. And it'll deviate into the wall of the root and create a ledge there, which is very difficult to then bypass to get back into the canal, simply because as you hit this and you use the filing motion, which is up and down, you find that a lot of dentine will get forced. I'll draw the dentine in yellow. The dentine actually starts to clog up the actual major canal here. So you get this filled with a dentine plug, which is virtually impossible to bypass. So that would have been a tricky curve to get around, and what they need to do is expand or enlarge the canal at this area here, and then pre-bend the file and pre-bend to get around this. And I haven't covered pre-bending, but pre-bending is just bending the tip of the file depending on the anatomy that you're bending it for. So sometimes you'll have a small bend here in the last 2 to 3 millimeters. Other canals you'll have a slightly longer bend, depending. So this is the tip of the file, maybe the last 2 millimeters. This would be the last 4 millimeters. And sometimes you have a very gradual curve over the length of the file, from the tip of the file down, and really depends on the curve of the canal that you're trying to follow or negotiate. Then come back to red. If you try to negotiate this with a rotary file, the rotary file will quickly sneak around there. In this area you'll have cyclic fatigue. I'll just put C, cyclic fatigue, and this file will break right here at the junction between the mesiolingual and the mesiobuccal canal in this root. So this root, remember, is the mesial root of a lower molar. Mesial. So what you'll end up doing is you'll have a chunk of nickel titanium just sitting right here in the canal. So once again, never take a rotary file where you haven't had a hand file before. So the hand file really has to make this glide path. So that is comment 1. Comment 2, always make sure that the dentist, if they're doing any kind of, especially, well, molar and anterior endodontics, they have 3 radiographs. 3 is critical because you have 1 straight on, and so you'd see something like this, where the periapical radiograph just literally sits straight behind the tooth, and the beam of the cone from the X-ray is straight in front of the from the X-ray is straight in front of that. Then the beam for the next radiograph, you would take it a little bit mesial, and you'll get something like that. And if there is 2 canals, you can start to separate them a little and see a little bit of the 3-dimension that isn't apparent in the previous radiograph. So that's first, that's second. Now 3, you'd never see this angulation because it's in the sagittal plane along the jaw, and you'd only see this with a cone beam. C, B, C, T. You can actually start to see the structure radiographically in the other plane that's not visible. But they could also, rather than going mesial with the cone, go distal. So literally just taking a tooth and taking the cone of your normal X-ray unit, pointing it straight to the tooth, then just moving it 20 degrees mesial and aiming it at the same tooth, and then moving it back 20 degrees so it's straight on again, and then moving it forward 20 degrees so it's distal. And those 3 angulations, straight, mesial 20 degrees, distal 20 degrees, gives you a very nice separation generally of any 3D structures. So that's the best you can do with 2D radiography. Take 3 radiographs, and then you might like to consider in complicated anatomy CBCT if it is available for that dentist. Once the dentist has cut their access cavity, make sure they always start to irrigate with sodium hypochlorite, tons and tons and tons. So that's the irrigation needle there, and really flood the whole chamber, and then suction it out. So suction, and then again and again and again, because what you find is that all through the pulp chamber, obviously when you're cutting the access cavity, there's chips of dentine and chips of amalgam and chips of whatever you're drilling, and that can obviously fall down the canal and block up the canal. So what you find is you can end up with copious bits in yellow here, chips of dentine and amalgam composite, whatever is there, and they just clog up all the canal, and you can get blocked out. So the canal can become blocked out very quickly. Okay, from the start, when you're cutting the access cavity, use copious sodium hypochlorite over here in the syringe. So here's the sodium hypochlorite, yeah, and literally flood the pulp chamber with that, and then suction it out, and do that continuously throughout the procedure. Just when you're using files, use a file, then irrigate, then use a small hand file, so which is called recapitulation. So file, irrigate, recapitulate, file, irrigate, recapitulate. And I'll talk a little bit about recapitulation soon, but it's a technique where you take a small hand file after any of the other hand files or any other rotary hand file, and just take an 06 or an 08, and just after the irrigation, after squirting irrigation down the canal, you take that small little hand file and just wiggle it around to loosen any of the debris, and make sure that the bigger rotary files haven't blocked out the canal, which is quite easy to do. Yeah, comment 4 is pretty important. It's just about the comment of or the technique of recapitulation. all that means is it's another use of a hand file. So if you fast forward to the rotary part, so remember there's three part. Well, there's finding, following. So finding is finding the canals, following is negotiating them and just finding the path down the canals, and then there's finishing. Finishing, remember finishing is using the rotary file. So when you're finishing, these are the steps you should do. You should use 1, the rotary file, and then 2, sodium hypochlorite, which is obviously irrigating. And then 3, you should take a small 08 hand file and just wiggle it round in the large canal, because obviously you're using rotary now and it's larger than an 08 file, and take it down to your working length, down to the working length, which I'm going to discuss next, and pass it just through the minor foramen, which I am also going to discuss next. One other comment I should have made previously is the reason why dentists should recapitulate is simply it helps stop blockage of the canal, and also it helps mix up all of the dentin debris that you're cutting off. Mix up dentin debris, DEBRIS, that is being generated. The debris is being generated by the rotary file. So the rotary file makes all this debris and dentinal chip. The irrigation then puts it into solution, and then the recapitulation and shaking it up with a small hand file just helps mix it all up, and then you suck it all out with the suction, and then you go back to the rotary file and do it again. So that's a cycle. So working length is from your reference point, which is quite often the buccal cusp, down to your minor foramen. So reference point, which let's say is the buccal cusp BC, down to the minor foramen or the minor constriction. So we know what a buccal cusp is, and literally the minor foramen is the smallest exit of the root canal. So if the root canal is coming down like this, it tends to get smaller, and here's the exterior of the root, something like that. And then this is the minor foramen here, and the major foramen is referred to as this part here, just around there. So working length would be from the minor foramen, back to the buccal cusp, if that was the reference point that the doctor was working to. Now, just one other point: when you're using a patency file, 08 file or an 06, the patency file will literally pass through the minor foramen, maybe 1 millimeter. So there's your 08 file, 08 size 08 file. Let's say you're using a triple flex, or K-flex, or whatever manufacturer you're using. Remember, it's triangular, and so it's very flexible. If you're using that, that passes literally through the minor foramen, and you don't have to pass it through there too many times. It's literally pass through, back, and make sure it's not blocked. So that was called a patency filing. Remember, rotary, irrigation, patency. When we look at pre-bending of hand files, and you look at these 3 roots, 1, 2, and 3, you can see the curvatures are very different in each canal. So as you work down the first, you've got a very sharp apical kink. Maybe this is 1 to 2 millimeters from here to the minor foramen. Then when you progress to root 2, maybe this is 3 to 4 millimeters, this curve in root 3 just extends right the way along. So if you take a look at how these two curves intersect, you've actually got a very sharp intersection point or angle between curve 1 and 2, and doing curve 1 and 2 in the second root is not quite as sharp, and then curve 3 is just literally gradual all the way through the curve. So the pre-bent hand file for number 1 would more than likely be in the last 1 millimeter, just like that. Probably the second one would be a little bit more gradual, so it'll be the last 2 millimeters, something like that. The third would be literally, the hand file would be curved like that. So here's a handle up here, by the way, handle of the hand file that you're pre-bending. So this would be about a 1 millimeter curve here, so 1 millimeter. This would be 2 to 3 millimeters, 2 to 3 millimeters. This would be a very gradual curve, maybe a little bit more than that. But so when it comes to selling files, you should always explain about stiff heat-treated small files in the 6, 8, and 10 sizes. And please make sure that you sell 21 millimeter in this length, because if they're any longer, the stiff files becomes too wobbly anyway. So those are the Comet patency files. Also sell or attempt to sell some flexible files, and these, remember, the triangular cross-section files, of which there are many. Triple flex, or even the rhomboidal ones, the K-flex files, the rhomboidal ones. And then you've got the standard K files, and these can be in all lengths. Then you can sell them a file bender. We talked about pre-bending files, and the file bender can create any bend, whatever the curve you want. So it makes, it's a little bit hard to describe on a video, but it makes either very tiny curves in the last 2 to 3 millimeters of the flutes, or it can make a longer, more gradual curve. DG16 probe, don't forget that. And for those people who really want to get into stuff, you can start to sell ultrasonic tips, which is a little bit more advanced, but really very, very useful for endo.